Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Japan Foundation Touring Film Program's Associate Talk, The Place of Bizen Pottery. My name is Junko Takekawa, Senior Arts Program Officer of Japan Foundation London, and I am responsible for the program contents. When I saw the film Haruka's Pottery, I thought that it was very unique in a way. The subject matter is about Bizen Pottery, one of 6 oldest kilns in Japan. I also thought that the film could be loosely categorized as work movies, where the story rotated around the professional making of Bizen pottery, introducing what the job is like. At the same time, the film can claim to be a feminist film, exploring the determination of a young woman who made herself an uninvited apprentice. Yet, this most characteristics in the film is that traditional pottery as well as its contemporary practice. It has been a very long time since our movement was first restricted by the lockdown. This film will take you to the Bizen province in Okayama and show you the practice of pottery making. Watching the film should give you pleasure, but you can also learn Bizen, almost like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Here is a trailer of Haruka's Pottery to remind you.
Bizen を作るんは土、火、そして人じゃ。
よう来るんじゃ。あんたみたいに上っ面だけのやつが。
あの釜炊きで親父が作ろうとしたもんをあいつはずっと追い求めとるんじゃ。
胸のランプをくゆらせて
あんたどこに何置いとんか全部覚えとんでも言う。覚えてます。
星をめぐる話をしましょう。
行さんの人とつながって
水
や聞こせ。
親父のような作家になるまでどんな修行にも望む言うて決めとったし。
ただ広がるあなたの気配。
これは陶芸の美しさに魅せられた人々の夢と伝統を紡ぐ物語。はるかの末。
The added bonus is that for today's event, the director of Haruka's Pottery, Suetsugu Naruhito, and an actual pottery maker in practice, Isizaki So, will join us to talk about their respective practice and the stories behind the film. Joining them is Dr. Robin Wilson, director of Anagama Kiln in Oxford University. He will give a quick introduction of Bizen pottery to warm up the conversation. Director Suetsugu and Mr. Isizaki are translated by Besan Jones. I'm very pleased to have you all, so thank you very much for joining us. I also extend my thanks to Phantom Film, the distributor of this film, especially Ms. Hatanori for her cooperation. Today's event will be recorded. As we are using a webinar function, your names will not be viewable by other attendees. However, I strongly recommend you to keep your audio or video muted throughout, just in case. If you have any question for the panelists, please use the Q&A function to send in your question at any time. Remember, the attendee's question may be seen by everybody else so that you can upvote a particular question placed by another person, which you would like to answer, or if it is the same as yours. Simply click the thumb up icon next to the question you wish to upvote. Unfortunately, due to time restrictions, we may not be able to pick up all the questions you asked, so apologize in advance. Lastly, as always, we will send you an online questionnaire So please spare a short moment to complete it for future events. Now, I'd like to hand it over Robin. Robin's already there on the screen, so I don't need to call you, just pass that baton on to you. So I hope you enjoy that talk, this talk event. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to introduce you. I'm Dr. Robin Wilson. I'm the director of Oxford Anagama Kilns, which is a project at Oxford University. We've got 3 Bizen-inspired kilns that we fire all the time. And that's why I've been asked to come along and talk to you today and to coordinate this project. What I'm going to do first is give you a quick introduction to the history of Bizen, so you've got a feeling for where Bizen sits in its own sense of itself, where it's going, where it's come from, and perhaps give a just touch upon some of the pots that you're likely to see from Bizen. But then I'm going to hand over to our potter and our filmmaker, and they're going to tell you much more about it. Now, what you should do, ask us questions, send them in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen. Send them all the time, and as Junko says, send them all the time. I'll pick them up at the end, and I'll ask them as we get to the end, once Isazaki-so and Suga-san have finished their presentations. Okay, so what I'll take you through now, briefly, could we have my PowerPoint, please? Thank you. Okay, this is me. This is I actually work with apprentices and people who work firing kilns. This is Mary Suzuki, who was firing one of our kilns in Oxford. Looks like Japan, but actually this is Oxford in two or 3 years ago, side stoking one of the kilns. So we'll move on. Could we go quickly through the first 3 slides, please? Thank you. This is our willow kiln firing at top temperature. This is a bit of drawing some hot pottery out of the front of our big brick kiln. And the next one, please. And here we go. Let's make a start. This is Bizen. I presume you all know something about Bizen, which is why you've joined us. But in case you don't know where it is, Bizen is in Okayama Prefecture. It's on the coast. And it's, as a site, it's been a major pottery center in Japan for about 1,000 years. So its methods and styles are copied, adopted, and adapted by potters all over the world, which is why it is important. The 3 kilns that we've got in Oxford, 2 of them were built by the kiln builder Takuma Takikawa from Bizen, and he was sent to us by Isazaki Jun-sensei, who is the living national treasure at Bizen currently. The other kiln we've got, the 3rd kiln, was built on archaeological work, which was done on Muromachi period kiln ruins that have been excavated in the foothills of the Bizen Mountains. Can we go to the next slide, please? We'll just have a quick look at Bizen, because I know what the other presenters are going to do. This gives you a bit of a look at what the town looks like. This is one of the kilns, surrounded by mountains. Imbe is sat in the valley. Do you want to move on? Next one, thank you. Here we go, a bit of reduction firing, mountain in behind. Traditionally, a lot of the clay comes from the mountains, but equally it comes from the paddy fields. And maybe we can talk to Isazaki-san about where their clays and things come from later, if anyone's interested in that kind of thing. But this is what Bizen looks like this is from my last trip. Do you want to go on one more? And this is the museum. So in Imbe Station, you've actually got a road running through it one side and a railway running through the valley the other. In the middle, you've got this lovely ceramics museum, and clustered around it, Imbe Village, which is where all of the potters are. Okay, next slide, please. Here we go. I would normally begin this very brief history of Bizen with a look at some unglazed Sueki offertory vessels, which were made on the coastal strip of land to the east of Okayama between the Kofun and Heian periods, which mean roughly from the 3rd to the 12th century AD. Do you want to move on, please? Thank you. Next, we would normally move through the story of the potters' competition for firewood with local sword makers. And there's a local sword making tradition in Bizen that you may not know about, which is equally interesting. So in the 12th century, that pushed the kiln site up into the hills above Imbe in the Bizen Valley and led to a new ceramic type, which was characterized by more utilitarian pestle and mortar vessels and jars, and the remains of which are common in the shard piles around the excavated kiln sites. If you look at the picture here closely, we're standing on a shard pile. There's a professor from Kyoto University, an archaeologist, and we're looking at a kiln, a Muromachi period kiln that's collapsed, and still has remnants of both the kiln and the pots in the shard pile. If you look at the piece that the gentleman is holding, it's striated with lines, and that's from the kiln. That's not a piece of pottery. That's actually the kiln itself. If you move on to the next slide, you can see where that striation came from. This is us building a replica of those kilns in Oxford, and this in Japan would have been done with bamboo. We had to use willow because that's all we've got. Brilliant. Next slide, please. Thank you. And this is what we built. This is a plan of an Anagama. If you don't know how these kilns are made, this shows it's a single chamber. And on again, please. There we go. And that's how it works. Essentially, you have the firebox on the left-hand side, the chimney on the right. The fire is drawn through and across the pots. And with a great deal of skill, you can produce absolutely fantastic ceramics using this ancient process, which is coming essentially from Korea from about the 6th and 7th century on. Okay, next slide. And what we built, this is Takusan's kiln in Bizen, and we copied that one actually exactly. If you move on to this one, this is in Oxford, and that's an exact copy. Now, the wares that these kilns produced were obviously successful because production expanded greatly during this time until we meet the mid-16th century, when this small Anagama type kiln of the sort you're looking at now moved down the valley. And then they were deliberately unified. They changed the kilns, and in their place, 3 large kilns were built in Bizen, and they were called the Okayama. And they're built in the lower north-facing slopes on the valley south of Bizen village. Do you want to go on to the next slide, please? This is the right-hand picture, shows you the trench in which the kiln is put. This is the Minami Okayama. This is the great southern kiln. And the picture on the left is showing you the shard, looking up at the shard pile. Now, exclusive guilds were responsible for the use of these kilns, and membership of the guild was a hereditary privilege belonging to limited numbers of named families, some of which still exist as potters in Bizen. These great kilns, the Okayama, produced perhaps 35,000 pieces of pottery at a time from month-long, once-a-year firings, and this represents the first golden age of Bizen. We'll go through 3 golden ages and a slight decline. This is the first golden age, these Okayama kilns. Now, by the middle of the late Muromachi or Sengoku period, which is the mid-1400s to mid-1500s, drinking powdered green tea known as matcha emerged as one element in opulent social gatherings held at residences of the ruling military elite. Now, it was at formal tea gatherings that all the refinements of Japanese culture were laid out on display for admiration as signifiers of elite status. Now, although dominated by warrior elites, the Muromachi saw the emergence of powerful, socially aspirant merchants who for the first time found themselves in position to penetrate this exclusive aristocratic culture. Could you move on to the next slide, please? There we go. That's another look. That's Bizen town in the background. And the next one as well, please. For quite practical economic reasons, the merchants didn't and couldn't duplicate the aristocratic style of tea ceremony, which requires lavish tea rooms and emphasized karamono. This is an example of a lovely Nasu-type Chinese tea caddy from the 13th century, which was owned by Oda Nobunaga. Now, karamono means Chinese things, and it usually refers to imported high-value ancient Chinese ceramics, which are characterized by brilliant glazes and elaborate forms. This one happens to be a Tenmoko type glaze. Now, instead of trying to compete on the same terms, the merchants attempted to change the rules of the game by appealing to a higher aesthetic ideal, and one aspect of which involved placing more utilitarian Japanese wares, such as Bizenyaki, alongside Chinese treasures of already admittedly high value, so that the Japanese works thereby gained validation through this juxtaposition. Now, the effect was then also to transfer the power of discrimination from the warriors to the merchants, who then discovered the ability to control native wares and could build the belief in the value, and then, of course, resell those Japanese wares at a profit. In this way, the place of homegrown Japanese ceramics was assured. Unglazed shigaraki and bizenware were the 2 main beneficiaries of this trend. Bizen flower vases for ikebana and water containers called mizusashi were particularly popular. And this constitutes the second and perhaps greatest golden age of Bizen. Now we move into a period of decline. At the beginning of the 17th century, tea culture fractured into different social groups and styles, and due to the inherent conflict between the ideals of supposed simplicity and the wealthy aspirations of the dominant hierarchy. As the attention of tea ceremony turned elsewhere, Bizen went into a decline. And that began in the Edo period and lasted right through to the Meiji. So this is 17th century to early 20th century. Potters in Bizen were, because of this, compelled to turn to other forms of ceramics than teaware and other markets to survive. So that almost as soon as it had blossomed, the second golden age of Bizen was over. Can you go through a next slide? This is a Guinomi, and move on again. Here we move. So these are Sakemono figures. The Sakemono figures became the main product of Bizen. At this stage, the giant Anagama kilns that we looked at earlier fell out of use, and smaller, more efficient kilns replaced them. These Sakemono that you're looking at now were increasingly mass-produced as Japan rapidly industrialized and ceramics, like other forms of manufacture, turned to ever more mechanized means of production. At times, even, Bizen was reduced to producing drain pipes in order to survive. If you go on the next slide, look, you can see this is producing the slope for a kiln. And James, who was my translator there, is standing next to a kiln which is going up a slope built on Bizen-yaki drain pipes. It's a fantastic thing to see. You see a lot of this in Bizen. Now, perhaps as a backlash against the factory production styles of the Meiji and in response to falling kiln numbers in Bizen, a movement developed prior to the Second World War where once again there was an attempt by a small number of craftsmen to return to making artistic products by hand. Now this is called the folk craft movement, and this is where Hamada, Yanagi, Leach fit into the story. Beauty is once again being sought in handmade things, and they're being used in everyday life. And we see the popularization of the concept of yonobi, which is the beauty in practical use. Interrupted by the war and further decline, the state of affairs continued until 1956, when a government act of parliament created what are colloquially known as the living national treasures. And Bizen was recognized by the appointment of its first living national treasure, Kinoshige Toyo. Because of the existence of two rival factions in Bizen, the figurine makers that we saw and the tea ceremony wheel throwers who are looking back to the Momoyama, this appointment was always going to be deeply controversial, but it turns out to have been the single most influential event in the modern era in Bizen. Toyo happened to be a wheel thrower. He started life as a figurine maker, but by the 1950s he was a wheel thrower. He researched and recreated ancient throwing and firing techniques, and he was also using a greatly modified kiln to exploit the possibilities of Bizen clay. And we could ask Isazaki-san about this later, particularly in terms of the long firing that Bizen clay needs. Do you want to move on a slide, please? Here we go. This is Kokurazaki's kiln. And move on again. This is a nice hybrid kiln. So in Bizen, you see a lot of hybrid kilns. There's an Anagama stuck on the left. There's an Anagama on the front, and there's an Borigama second chamber on the back of that. So they're really exciting kilns. We happen to be very lucky today because Isazaki-san is firing a kiln. So we'll have a look at one of these in operation later. Now, from the 1960s, department store exhibitions became popular in Japan. Changes in society meant that more ordinary people, quite often women, felt encouraged to find personal meaning and learning through the etiquette of tea ceremony. And for the first time, they're also able to afford the necessary utensils to practice it. Thus, on the back of a post-war 1960s and 70s revival of the interest in tea ceremony again, Bizen starts to enter its third golden age, and it expands until it reached the point it's at now, where there are well over 400 working potters in Bizen, almost all of which with their own private family kilns. And also with a permanent ceramic school in Bizen. Now, do you want to go on a slide? This is Isazaki Jun Sensei, the living national treasure in Oxford, inaugurating our first brick kiln. And if you move on to my last slide, this is the Togai Center in Bizen, where you have a mix of young potters, people who are aspiring, people about whom the film is being made, really, hoping to join in some way, either through apprenticeship or through learning and college courses, the process of being a potter at Bizen. Now, that's not quite the end of the story, but I'll finish there. because I think it's at this point, it's probably worth as well going over to our potters and filmmakers to hear what they say. Now, at this point, Bizen hit a high water mark in the late 1980s. Because for various reasons, the Chanoyu market, the tea ceremony market in Japan, has been in a slight decline, albeit from a very high base. Now, against the backdrop of that, there's been an expanding global market for Japanese culture, food, and art. And this is the point at which we find ourselves with Bizen potters. You'll see young Bizen potters, you'll see exhibitions of Bizenyaki all over the world at the moment. And part of that is relating to this change from an internal to an external market. And that is hopefully what we'll learn about today. If you'd like to finish my slideshow now. That's brilliant. Thank you. Now that's a very, very quick run through the history of Bizen. That normally would take me 2 hours. So if you have any questions about that, you can ask them at the end as well, potentially. But at this point, I would like to bring into the discussion, first of all, to introduce himself and then to tell us a little bit about his work. Isazaki So-san, who is a potter of Bizen. Isazaki-san, are you there? Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Tell us a little bit about your work and introduce yourself.
はい、備前焼き作家をしております、伊勢崎壮と申します。今52歳です。先ほど、ロビンさんが言った、名前も言いましたけど、伊勢崎純はおじにあたります。
Hello, I am a Bizen potter. My name is Isazaki So. I'm 52 years old, and I am the nephew of Isazaki Jun, mentioned by Robin.
それでは少し、私の今作っている作品を見ていただきたいと思います。スライドをお願いします。
So if we can get my slides up, I'll show you some of my work.
はい、私の名前です。佐々木壮と申します。次のスライドお願いします。
That's me, Isazaki So. Next slide.
私は、Anagamaではなくて登り窯を使っています。
So I use a Noborigama climbing kiln rather than an Anagama.
Anagama よりも、灰の振り方が割とこう上から下へということで、それに合う形を考えています。
With a Noborigama, a climbing kiln, the ash tends to fall onto the pieces from above in a slightly different way to with an Anagama kiln. And so I create pieces that make the most of that effect.
次お願いします。
Next, please.
これも同じような形なんですけれども、上から灰が降ることによって、レリーフ状に施した稜線、角がつくことで灰のかかりをコントロールして、見ようということでやっています。
So again here you can see how the ash has fallen onto the piece from above, leaving this design on the pot.
次お願いします。
Next, please.
これは火出す機なんですけれども、焼き方としては、空気をたくさん送って焼く明るい焼けなんですけども、火出す機の赤い線と、同じようにレリーフ状の形、四角い形なんですけども、それの効果を狙ったものです。
So this is a hidaski, example of where a piece has been surrounded by straw that burns off, leaving red marks. すいません、鈴木さん、少し聞こえづらいんですけれども。
はい、すみません。LINE の方でしょうか。
Zoom です。
Zoom、はい。じゃあ次お願いします。
Next, please.
同じ形で、これはゴマの、いわゆる灰油なんですけども、焼き方によって全然こう見るイメージが違うというところを見ていただきたいです。これは水差しですね。お茶のお水を入れる道具なんですけれども、それに展開しました。
This is a water jug used in the tea ceremony, and you see here the goma sesame pattern, which is caused by the ash falling again onto the piece. But you can see how different the outcome is depending on how the ash deposits itself onto the piece in the kiln.
蓋は漆で作っています。
The lid is lacquer.
次お願いします。
Next, please.
これもは穴窯で焼いたものです。焼き方が、窯が変わると、同じ筒でもかなり表情が違うということを見ていただきたいです。
This is made in the Anagama, in an Anagama kiln. The method of firing is the same, but as you can see, you give it a very different outcome.
はい、次お願いします。
Next, please.
これは、茶碗ですね。これも木助なんですけれども、すべてにおいてこういった、稜線レリーフ状の模様をつけることを今は、楽しんでやっています。
This again is a piece of hidaski, and I really enjoy trying to attain these different effects in my work.
次お願いします。
Next, please.
これが今一番新しい作品の一つで、作品です。これは花器、すべて今まで茶碗、水差し、それから壺など花器類を見ていただいたんですけれども、これは、前後にかなり薄く作ってます。ろくろを引いた後に変形させるんですけれども、非常にこう、かなり土に負担をかけるような形なので、傷が多いというのが今課題です。
This is one of my latest pieces. It's a vase. So you've seen some of my some jugs, some water pitchers, some tea bowls. This is a vase. After I threw it on the wheel, I then deformed the shape, and it's a shape that puts quite a lot of stress on the clay itself. And so one of the issues with this type of piece is that you get quite a lot of cracking.
次お願いします。
Next.
同じ作品の上から見た写真です。こういった形で、最初は丸く引いているものからかなり、大きく変形させることで、新たな形を創作したいと思っています。
This is the same piece from above. It starts off as round, and then I do quite a lot of work to change the shape and deform it, as you can see here.
はい、次お願いします。
Next, please.
これは伝統的な備前焼きの形なんですけれども、やはりこういった、焼き色が出る場所には、今までのような作品よりもこういった伝統的な形が合うと思い、これも一つの備前焼きならではの形と思って、追求していっています。
This is a very traditional Bizen yaki shape. And as you can see, it really suits the type of patterns that you get with the firing in the kilns. And so I continue to make these traditional shapes in addition to the ones I've shown you.
これは三角花入れと言います。
This is a triangular flower vase.
次お願いします。
Next, please.
同じ焼き方なんですけども、これはとっぷり型の花入れです。大きさは高さが20センチ以上、25センチぐらいあるんですけれども、花入れ、一輪挿しです。こういった形もこういう焼きが非常に合うと思います。
This is another flower vase. It's a sake bottle-shaped flower vase for a single bloom. It's about 25 centimeters high, using the same firing technique. And as you can see, it really suits this type of firing technique.
次お願いします。
Next, please.
これはろくろではなくて叩きという、スラブで作る作品なんですけれども、備前の伝統的な形、こういうのはやっぱり同じような焼きが合うと思います。
This is another traditional Bizen yaki form. It's a slab rather than throne.
次お願いします。ここからは、素材の話になるんですけれども、このインベで取れる土、火寄せと言いますけれども、これを使っています。
Moving on to the materials, this is Hirose, the type of clay that we get from imbe, which is what I use.
そして次お願いします。
Next, please.
そして、ろくろですね。そしてその備前の場合土、そして美術のろくろというもの。そして次のスライド、ろくろから次のスライドをお願いします。
This is the wheel. This is the clay actually being used. Let's go to the next slide.
そして、焼き物の大切な窯焚き、ファイアリングなんですけども、今でもこの窯を使って焼いています。ちょうど今焼いているので、もし、時間があれば後ほど紹介したいと思います。
And this is the all-important firing. This is the kiln that I use now. It's actually being fired right now. So if we have time afterwards, maybe you'd like to have a look.
はい、次をお願いします。
Next slide.
まだここまでは行ってないですけども、最終的にはこういった状態にまで、温度的には1250度という温度まで上げていきます。
This is the final stages of firing. We're not here yet today, but at this point, the temperature is 1250 degrees C.
次お願いします。
Next, please.
窯の中はこういうような状態です。
This is inside of the kiln.
次お願いします。
And next.
そして焼き上がると、こういった状態で窯の中は、最後、窯出しに向かいます。
And then these are the pieces, finished pieces inside the kiln waiting to be unloaded.
一番窯の天井に近い高い位置に置くと、松の灰がたくさんかかり、こういった状態になります。
These pieces are the nearest to the ceiling of the kiln, and they've got a lot of the pine ash on them.
はい、次お願いします。
Next, please.
終わりですね。
that was the last one.
はい、簡単ですけど、私の仕事を紹介させていただきました。
That was a very brief introduction to some of my work. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Isazaki-san. A lot of questions are coming. A lot of questions have come in. We'll save them till the end. Junko-san has just said to everybody, if you haven't read the chat thing, you don't have to go at 1 o'clock. We'll probably continue till 1:15 or so on. Don't go until you're told, she says. We'll now move. I've got some lovely questions there, but I'm gonna save those. Thank you so much for that. That was magnificent. I've got questions that I would ask all day on just one of those pots. At this point, though, we will turn now to Naruhito Tsuetsuga-san, and he's going to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about the film that he's made in conjunction with the Bizen Potters, and hopefully some of you will have seen this film. If you haven't, you should see it. It's wonderful, and it conveys Bizen beautifully. Let's hear about it now. Tsuetsuga-san, over to you.
はい、皆さんこんにちは。はるかの末の監督をしました、末次です。
Hello, my name is Suetsugu. I'm the director of Haruka's Pottery.
はい、私は日本の伝統工芸の、作り手の取材を長年行ってきました。
I've been interviewing traditional Japanese craftspeople for many years.
で、一番最初に訪れた備前焼のこの美しさであったり考え方に魅了されて、この映画を撮りました。
And I was struck by the beauty and the thinking behind Bizenware the very first time I went there, which is how I ended up making a film about it.
はい、以上です。
That's all.
Brilliant. In that case, should I move on to some questions? In that case, could I ask you, because I think we ought to talk about the film a little bit more at the moment. I'm assuming you've all seen the introduction and the trailer. So Tsuga-san, could you tell me where the idea for the film came from, and the issues that you were hoping to raise by making it? And who is your audience? Who-
そして誰向け、
はい、先ほども申し上げましたけれども、日本の伝統工芸の作り手に、北から南までたくさんの方を取材して、そこで日本の手仕事の素晴らしさを知りました。で、その素晴らしさを知ったと同時に、その現状の後継者不足の課題であったりだとか、そういったものを目の当たりにして、私で何かできることはないかなっていうことがきっかけで、この映画を着想することになりました。
Well, as I mentioned, I have interviewed traditional Japanese craftspeople all over Japan and really learned in the process how wonderful Japanese traditional crafts are. But at the same time, I've heard about the lack of people to take over these wonderful crafts. And I wondered whether there might be something I could do about this, something I could do to help, which really was the idea behind the film.
Okay, I was actually a question came in from one of our viewers that ties in with this. And we're asked. There's been a big increase in people studying in Japan crafts in technical colleges and so forth, rather than the traditional apprenticeships. And the photograph I showed at the end of my PowerPoint was in it was in the Togoi Center, which is where you get technical qualifications in ceramics in Bizen, as opposed to learning by apprenticeship. So the question is, do you think that learning by technical skills is a significant development, given that more people are doing it? And does it offer actually more opportunities in reality to become a potter? This is a question possibly that we could ask both of our panelists, really, but thank you, Bethan.
これは磯崎さん。
そうですね。増えたと思います。やはり時代の流れといいますか、そういった研修施設は、何十年も前からありますけれども、さらに進んで現代になると、それこそ YouTube とかでもいろんな技術を見ることができるので、それも一つの選択肢となっていることが、いい方向もあり、悪い部分もあると思います。
I think, yes, there are more opportunities nowadays to get involved compared to a few decades ago. You can see it now on YouTube. There are much more opportunities to come into contact. And there are both good and bad sides to that.
In a simple way to follow on from that, somebody's asking, is the resurgence in Bizen something that we're seeing in the other potteries, the other medieval pottery centers of Japan? They've been, if you don't know about it, 6 medieval kiln sites were designated in Japan in the 1940s, to which public attention was drawn. Bizen is one of those. And Bizen is very much seen outside of Japan. Is this true, do you think, for the other kiln sites? And this is really a question for Naruhito-san, just because he's worked with other potters and across Japan. Thank you.
ちょっと音が途切れました。
Difficult question, sorry.
ちょっと音が途切れるんですけど。はい、聞こえます。はい、聞こえます。はいはいはい。そうですね。日本の伝統工芸自体が今すごく海外に向けて精力的に発信してると思うんですね。ここ近年で。その影響もあって、いろんな産地の伝統工芸という価値が見直されつつあるんではないかなと思います。
I think, yes. I think Japanese traditional craft in general is enjoying a bit of a resurgence because there's a lot of activity right now to try and promote these regions and their traditional crafts overseas. And so I think there is a general resurgence happening at the moment.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Now I've got a fairly exciting mix between technical questions about pottery for Isazaki-san and film questions. Shall we move briefly to some pottery questions, which can be answered probably quite quickly? Are most kilns still wood-fired, or are they done with electricity in Bizen? That's a fairly easy question to answer. And likewise, are the potteries usually family-run businesses, or are they master-student type things? Is it still a entirely family-run? Is that the right impression that we should take away?
はい、窯は、今でも、メインは上り窯もしくは穴窯を使っています。それはもう備前のスタイルとしては、電気、ガスへ移行できないっていうものがあります。そして窯を焼くのはもう家族内でやられている方も多いですけれども、備前は昔から、共同窯という協力し合って焼く、窯の焼く日数が長期間にわたる、今の現代の僕のサイズでも2週間ぐらい焼くので、家族内だけではなかなか焼けないという状況がありますので、作家仲間、共に備前焼を作っている仲間と共同で焼くということが多いと思います。
The kilns in Bizen are still mostly traditional Anagama type stick kilns or Noborigama climbing kilns, and these can't really use gas or electricity, so they are mostly wood kilns in Bizen. There are family-run kilns, but a lot of kilns have historically been shared kilns because we fire for a long time. 2 weeks or more, and this can be hard to operate with just one family. So a group of potters would get together and they would fire a kiln together.
Is this a good time for Isazaki-san perhaps to show us very briefly the firing as it's taking place? Because he sat in a room now, you can't quite see it, but he's actually next door. Could you show us quickly? It would be wonderful if you could.
Of course.
Thank you. Now, hopefully the connection won't go, and we will find ourselves shortly into a kiln shed, which is a very familiar place to be. Now, if you...
I'm on the move. Here is the kiln. This firing's only just started. We're on day 4 today. So it's more than a week to go.
僕の弟子ですね。弟子だった佐々木くんです。
This is Sasaki-kun, my apprentice, my former apprentice.
今は先生です。マスターです。
Now he's a master himself.
はい。こんな感じで、ですね。
So that's the kiln.
まだ、はい。温度が見えますかね。
Can you see the temperature up there?
577度。まだまだ焼けてないですね。
577 degrees. So there's a long way to go.
赤松の松割り機。
Here's the red
まだまだ
pine.
全然足りないですね。これからまたどんどん持ってきます。
We don't have
こういう状
enough
況
yet.
で、はい。
There's a lot more yet to come.
なかなか一人家族内ではできないので、彼のような、一緒にやった仲間と窯を炊くというのが今のスタイルだと思います。
As you can see, it's quite a lot of work for a single family to do. So just as I'm doing here, it's normal to share a firing.
That is that's magnificent. Thank you so much for showing us that. Yes. Now then, given that we've now seen in practice a firing taking place. And Isazaki-san, thank you for taking time out of the firing because it's an intense period when you're firing kilns. Thank you so much for taking the time to show us this. Now, to turn to the film, could you tell us, Sotsugu-san, how did you work with the potters? How in Bizen? I work with potters all the time, and again, I like you. I'm interviewing, working with firing kilns. It's a busy time. How did you learn what you learned? How did you learn enough to make the film? Because the film is a magnificent view of Bizen. I mean, it's technically a wonderful film, but you've had to do a lot of work to work with real potters who are busy, who are making their living doing something other than films. How did you do it? Can you tell us a bit? Just give us the story of how you engaged with them, what happened, how it worked. I find that very interesting because it's something I do myself. And I'm sure people would like to hear how you made the film.
備前、はい。備前の方々が非常にこうフレンドリーでして、初めて備前に訪れた時も、最初の日にこうみんなでこう飲みに連れてってくれたりだとか、非常に仲良くしていただいたんです。
The people of Bizen are really friendly. The very first time I went there, they took me out drinking.
で、きっかけはそういう感じだったんですけれども、ですね、だんだんその普段、作家さんたちがこう飲んでる時はもう普通の人たちなんですけど、やっぱそのお仕事をしてたりこう作刀をしてる姿っていうのがこうガラッて変わってですね、非常にこうなんていうかそのフォルムが美しいというか、その姿勢が美しいなっていうふうに、見てて思って、それをこう思わずやっぱ撮りたくなったっていうのがありまして、まあ、きっかけはそういう感じではあったんですけれども、だんだんそこからこう興味を持って備前焼っていうものを、まあ、半分こうなんていうんですか、自分の趣味のような形で調べる始めるとどんどん興味が湧いてきて、なんていうかその考え方であったりだとか、そういう他の焼き物とは違う魅力っていうものが自分に合ってるなっていうふうに思って、皆さんと仲良くさせていただいても、なんていうんですかね、こう本当に全面協力していただいて、何でもお答えいただいて、本当にこうみんなで作ったっていうような映画です。
はい。
はい。
So we got on really well, and when we were out drinking together, the Potters were just normal people. But as soon as they started working, they just changed completely, and this transformation and the sight of them at work was something I found really beautiful and that I really wanted to capture on film. And then as I was doing that, I gradually became more and more interested in what it was they were actually doing, and it sort of became a hobby of mine. And I started to learn more about Bizen, and as I learned more, I got more interested. I got interested in the thinking behind Bizen-yaki and how it's different to other forms of pottery, and it somehow seemed to suit me. And the potters themselves were incredibly helpful. They answered everything I asked, and it really feels like a joint effort that we made this film together.
That's wonderful. Could you, following on from that, could you talk a bit about how, because there's a balance between a storyline, and you could possibly talk about where the initial storyline came from, and that's balanced with the technical, so with some of the technical aspects. There's some lovely spiral wedging. There's a little bit of stoking in there. There are a whole range of technical things that have been put into the film. Could you talk about what the story is, where it came from, and then how you decided what bits of the technique you would put in, and then thirdly, how closely does that represent both the process of making and the process of becoming an apprentice in Bizen? I mean, that's quite a big question. That's combining 3 or 4 questions at once. Thank you, Bethan.
そうですね。ストーリーは基本原作漫画があったんですよ。
The story is actually based on a manga.
はい、もちろんその映画用に脚色はして書いてるんですけれども、はい、でその漫画自体にその備前焼の制作工程が丁寧に描かれてるんですね。だそこっていうのはやっぱその映画を見てもどういうふうに作られてるのかとか、どういう思いで作られてるんだとかっていうのは私がこう取材させていただいた作家さんからお聞きした言葉っていうのを印象に残っている、言葉とかをセリフに落とし込んで脚本を作りました。
Of course, I did adapt it from the manga to make a film. The manga itself depicts the process of making the Bizen yaki in a very detailed way, and I wanted to make sure that came across in the film, how it's made, and also the feelings of the potters themselves, which is something that I ascertained through interviews with some of the potters, and I used the things that they said that really had an impact on me and wrote them into the script.
Brilliant. Sorry. I was going to then ask
どこまでリアルかっていうのは多分それは伊勢崎さんに聞いていただいた方がいいかと思うんですけど、多分あんなに作家さんは怖くないと思います。
In terms of how realistic it is, I think maybe we need to ask Isazaki-san that question. But the real life potters aren't as scary as the ones in the film.
Oh, that's not entirely true. I was just going to say that. Bethan, could you ask Isazaki-san, please, how did he think it was a realistic portrayal of his craft, and whether it captured the essence of it perfectly?
かなりリアルに描いていただいてまして、撮影日数も少なかったので、釜炊きのシーンっていうのはタイミング的になかなか撮れない状況だったんですけれども、そこは、我々よりも若い人たち、我々はその携わってたものはもう CG でもいいんじゃないかみたいな話もしてたんですけれどもでも若い作家ですね、協力してくれた青年部と言われる、30代40代の若い作家はそこを CG にしたらもう備前焼じゃなくなるっていうもう心強いなんていうんですかね、熱い思いを言ってくれて、じゃあやりましょうということで実際の薪を燃やして窯のシーンも撮りましたし、あと弟子と先生の関係性というのは現代では少なくなりましたけれども、昔からそれはもうこの先生の作品に、魅了されてその先生のところで勉強するっていう基本的な、その作品を好きだという思い、そういった情熱みたいなのは形は変われど今でも残っていると思います。なかなかその弟子を迎え入れる側の問題もありますし、入る方の心の問題もありますけれども、その弟子に実際入る入らないは別として備前焼を勉強したいっていう思いは今も昔も全く変わってないなっていう感じはします。
はい。青年部っていうのは映画側、撮影側ですか？
すみません。撮影、
陶芸家側。
撮影スタッフではないですね。
はい。
撮影スタッフ
作家さん、若いスタッフさん。
作家の方ですね。はい、すみません。はい。
It's pretty realistic. We didn't have that long to film, and what was particularly tricky was the firing. and getting the timing right to be able to film that. And there were some of the younger people who said, well, couldn't we just do that bit using computer graphics? But fortunately, there were some of the younger makers, some of the younger potters in their 30s and 40s who said, if you don't show the actual real firing, it's not Bizen, it's not Bizen Yaki anymore. And so we did make the effort to actually film the real kiln firing. The relationship between master and apprentice it's not so much like that nowadays, but it certainly did exist in that form in the past, that an apprentice would see the master's work and be attracted to it and feel this passion for the master's work. But that passion still exists today, whether or not in the form of master-apprentice. The passion and the desire to study and to learn and to become a Bizen potter is the same to this day.
That's fantastic. Again, I've got in front of me quite a lot of questions now, some of which are technical about the firing, which Isazaki-san can answer very, very quickly. I've got one question for Junko, which you could answer, Junko-san, at the end. Somebody has asked me, is it possible to see the film in the US or UK because the film festival screenings have sold out? So Junko-san, I'm sure you can tell us all how to see the film if we haven't seen it, but let's do that at the end. Now, if I could ask Isazaki-san, I know he's got a pot sat next to him. A really compelling way to talk to makers and potters about what they're doing is to listen to them talk about their things.
何点かあります。
Exactly. Could you talk us through one of your pots, Isazaki-san? And perhaps one of the questions I would like you to deal with that somebody's asked, if you could ask Bethan, is having looked at the really broad range of expression in Bizen Yaki in the product, the process itself is quite straightforward and quite simple. Could he talk about the art, the value of that art that he sees in that simple process but a complicated expression, and talk just briefly about what he's trying to say with it, and using a piece that he happens to have by him to talk us through that. That would be really interesting for us. Thank you.
はい。備前焼きはやはりその土をただ焼くだけ、今ロジンさん言われたようにすごくシンプルな焼き物なんですけど、その素材をどう生かすかということが、その始まりからずっとその時代に考えられてきた焼き物だと思います。その時代に求められる形、用途をこの素材を使ってどのように形にすればその時代にその人々に寄り添うものができるかということを考えてきた中で、いろいろなものを表現してきたと思います。決してこの作家主体、作家が表現したいだけではなくて、その素材との対話の中でその扱い方っていうものを考えてきた歴史があります。はい。
As you say, Robin, it's a very simple art form. It's just the firing of clay. And yet it's all about how you use that material, how you use that clay. A lot of thought has gone into that over the years. And in each era, people have thought about what is the form that we need now? What is the function that we need now? And how do we achieve that with this material? And that's how you get such a range of expression. It's not just a potter bending the clay to their will. It's a conversation that they have with the materials.
そうした中で今現在自分としては形の面では備前焼っていうのはすごくこう素朴で野趣あふれるワイルドな感じっていうのも感じられる部分もあるんですけれども、やはり桃山時代の茶道が始まった頃の優雅な形っていうものを自分の作品の中に取り入れられたらなと思っています。そして形のアウトライン、それからそのレリーフ上のラインなどは そういった自在のこう柔らかいラインを備前焼の中に、自分の作品の中に、取り入れられたらなと思って今作っています。
What I try to do with my work is keep that simpleness and roughness of form that Bizen has, but at the same time try to incorporate the elegance of the Momoyama era pots, and also incorporate those soft outlines that you get with Bizen Yaki. It's all that's what I'm trying to incorporate into my work.
Somebody's asking me, Isazaki-san, how predictable are the ash and straw flame markings on the pot, and do you always get the effects that you expect? And then there are quite a lot of technical questions about the kilns, which essentially you could say, how many pots do you fire at once? How much wood do you use? And how often do you fire it? Also, a final and lengthy question, which is rather more difficult. Bethan, how do both of these makers feel that their pots and the film of their pots add to people's value in their lives and their appreciation of their lives? And that final question goes to both of the panelists.
ありがとうございます。はい。最初の質問は、かなりの確率で備前焼の場合は狙っていけると僕は考えています。自分が焼きたい色、焼きたい模様、灰のかかりとかっていうのは、蓄積された技術とか、そういったもので、かなり狙ってはいけるんですけれども、ご存知のように自然に灰がかかるということで、上薬のように筆を使って絵を描くようにはいかないんですね。ですから、毎回その自分が思ってもいないイレギュラーなものが出るんですけれども、そのイレギュラーをレギュラーに変えていく努力は毎回しています。イレギュラーを良しとして面白いと感じたら、それをどうしたら出るかっていうのをみんな考えながら、次の窯焚きへ向けて、いろいろ考えていきます。そういった作業の繰り返しによって、だんだんとこう狙ったものが狙ったように、できるわけなんですけども、これは備前焼の面白いところで、その人知、人の手によるところ以外のところが関係している部分もあるので、そこが自然と一緒になって焼くっていう備前焼の魅力で、そのところをどうやって自分なりの考え方で、自分の思い通りにしていくかっていう、それの繰り返しですね。なかなか思い通りにいかない部分もあるんですけれども、狙ったところはかなりできるようにはなっていると思います。
In general, I can generally achieve the effect that I'm after. Because of the technical knowledge and the experience that I have, I can generally predict what sort of a pattern the ash is going to give me. But of course, it's a natural process. I'm not brushing the glaze onto the pots, so I can't control it in the same way, and there are always irregularities. However, if I like those irregularities, if I like the effect that's been achieved, then I will try to work out how to replicate that on the next firing. And in general, I can achieve the effect that I'm going for, as I say. And that's the beauty of Bizen, where it's not just your technique and skill. There is an element of nature involved in creating the pots. You're working together with nature and thinking about how to make use of those natural effects and how to replicate them.
その後の質問で、自分の作品が、今その映画を見ていただいた方、作品を見ていた方にどう影響するかというところなんですけれども、やはりその備前焼の魅力の、一部分でも自分の作品から、その魅力を感じてもらって、こういった焼き物を使い続けて、また 愛し続けていただけたらなと、そして何百年も続いていますので、今後またさらに長い歴史を積み重ねていく中の一人の作家でありたいなと思います。
In terms of what I think, what I hope the film will bring to people, I hope it will express some of the appeal of Bizen-yaki, and that people will want to use Bizen-yaki and to love Bizen-yaki, and it's got a very long history, hundreds of years, and I hope that it will have a long future.
以上です。
And that's it for me.
Thank you. Can I turn back to the film briefly? I know it's based on manga, and I remember when I was in Bizen, I saw some of the manga, the paper copies of the books that the manga story was based on, and I realized that you've changed the story quite a lot for the film. Now, questions people are asking: did you choose the woman or a woman as a main character because you wanted a relationship between her and the potter to develop, or for other reasons? And does it reflect a reality in Bizen? Are there many female potters in Bizen? Is it ever more difficult to be a female than a male potter? Does that make a difference? And is the situation of who can be a potter, whether male, female, insider, outsider, is that something that at the moment in Bizen is changing? And presumably both of you can obviously answer that, but from a film point of view, from a researcher looking at these potters, what did you feel about placing a female character as the lead in this film? I think summarizes those questions.
僕でいいですかね。はい。
どうぞ。
主人公が女性っていうのは、原作が女性が主人公だったっていうのはあるんですけれども、やっぱ今その日本で陶芸女子になる言葉が結構、ありまして、女性の方が非常に焼き物であったりだとかお皿だとか、料理っていうものが好む傾向があるかなと思うので、女性っていう設定に原作の方がされたのかなっていうふうには思います。で、ちょっとさっきの、この映画を通して何を与えているかっていうご質問があったかと思うんですけど、それちょっと僕なりの意見言わせていただくと、この映画はそのテーマが備前焼以外に一人の女性の成長物語でもあるんですけれども、その、女性が、好きなものを見つけて一生懸命取り込んでいく時の力強さであったりとか、そういった美しさであったり、そういったものをこの映画で、表現したいなっていうふうに非常に思いました。はい。
In terms of the female protagonist, the protagonist in the manga that the film was based on is female, and I think maybe part of that was because a lot of women in Japan do like ceramics. They like pottery, maybe they come to it through cooking, but they like ceramics. In terms of what the film can bring to people, it's not just about the pottery. Of course, Bizen-yaki is there, but it's also about one woman and her development and her growth, and I wanted to show the strength that it gives you when you find something that you love and dedicate yourself to it.
Thank you for that. That almost brings us to the end of the questions. There's one more technical question, which is something I'm interested in, and people ask me, and somebody has just asked. When we're firing our kilns in the future, people look at the kilns and they look at these great piles of wood that we're burning to fire them, and they say, "Is this sustainable? Can you do this in the future? Is this going to work? Is it worth doing it now?" And those are questions which I think I think the pottery is of a value that it does justify what we're doing. These are things that you don't throw away. These are pieces that are intergenerational items that we'll keep forever. But people look at the wood, they look at the reduction smoke puffing out of the kilns. Are we going to be seeing Bizen in 100 years' time? How is it developing, and where's it going? And that sort of, again, that's what the film is trying to address in terms of people. Environmentally, is this something that's sustainable as well? Again, that's a big question, and that sort of brings us near to the end of our discussion. I think if you have any more questions, do send them in now, because we're getting near to our time. Thank you, Bethan.
私です。はい。よく最近言われている、そういう SDGs 的な話にもなるんですけれども、持続可能なっていう、ちょっとそういうところに敏感な方にとっては、非常に備前焼の薪を燃やしているっていう、映像とか、そういうものを見ると、非常に環境問題と結びつけられる方もおられると思うんですけれども、今、自分の周りにも、500年前の甕が実用ではないですけれども飾られてたり、その作られた過程でそういうものが使われてても、それが大切に長く使われることによってその、環境問題っていうのがただ短期的なその使い捨てではない文化っていうものが日本にはあると思うので、そことちょっと少し対比させていただいて考えていただくと、その一部分的なその窯焚き薪を大量に使うっていうところだけを切り取るんではなくて、そこから作られたものの価値、それが何百年も使えれるっていうことを考えると、非常にそれはかえって逆説的に、環境にはそんなに負荷がないんじゃないかっていう考え方を作り手側なので、そういう意見、そういう考えをもう少しあるんじゃないかっていうことを理解していただいて、もう少しこの問題に関しては、今はなかなか断定はできないんですけれども、時代的に、問われる部分だろうと思いますけども、そこは携わっているものとして全く無視はできないと思うので、考えてはいきたいと思います。
Yes, there are people, of course, who see all the wood being burnt and connect that to environmental problems, sustainability, and so on. But I think you can't just look at that. You have to look at what's being made. And as you say, those objects, the pieces that are coming out of the kilns, are being used for hundreds of years. They're not disposable items. They have a value, and when you think about that, I think that in that sense you're placing less of a burden on the environment, because you're making something that's going to be can be used for hundreds of years. That's how I, as a creator, feel. Although, of course, I realize the responsibility, and it's something that I will continue to think about.
That's absolutely magnificent. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. We can't take any more at the moment, sadly. We're going to have to finish there. Thank you for everybody who's sent questions into us, and thank you for listening to us and seeing the films and listening to the history of Bizen and seeing the fire. We were so privileged to see a firing as well. I mean, that's fantastic. Do see the film. If you have any more questions, you can always contact the Japan Foundation, or look out for exhibitions for Bizenware. Look out for the kiln firings at Oxford. This doesn't happen in isolation. You can find this stuff online. There's a lot about Bizenyaki, Bizenware, about firers and about potters, and it's really a very active, very vibrant pottery scene at the moment. And there's lots to ask and there's lots to examine. We've barely touched the surface of this. We could talk for hours about a single pot. Really, we could. So thank you so much, all of you, for doing this. And now I'm going to hand back over to Junko-san, who will tell us where we're going now and bring hopefully this session to a happy conclusion. Thank you so much again, everybody who's participated. Thank you, Suetsu-san. Thank you, Isazaki-san. Thank you,
ありがとうございました。
Junko, for organising it. Junko-san, will you take over now, and I'll
Thank you
hand
so
back.
much. As some audience asked about the tickets, and then Robin actually mentioned, brought it up. Yes, we will going to release some tickets for that repeat screening tomorrow at noon. But of course, tickets numbers are limited, and we can't really guarantee that everybody can actually watch it. But hopefully, this film can be screened some other places in the world. Unfortunately, this time it's UK only. So anybody who joined for this talk from outside UK, unfortunately, you can't watch it. But this is a great film, good film, and very, very insightful and useful. So I hope that some sort of film organizers or programmer will pick up this film in the future to come. So thank you so much. I mean, as I said in the rehearsal, I said to both of you that one of that's interesting point I just found in this film is that Potter talks about finance and the economy and how much loss that they will make if they can't properly. We have done quite a lot of pottery talk and ceramic talks or whatever, but we never touched upon that kind of reality of the economics. And then so if you see the film, you know that those people are actually making a living out of it rather than just making a great sort of potter for many generations to come. So it actually brings you down to that reality that they are one of that kind of professional occupation. They are, as well as they are artists. So that was a very interesting film. I hope you can get the tickets tomorrow. But thank you so much for Robin, conducting that a great discussion as well as a presentation. I know it's very difficult for you to actually concise it into that 10 minutes, in the slideshow, and you yourself must have had quite a lot of questions to ask. And as Robin said, we couldn't actually pick up every question, but thank you so much. Darian, do you think you can show us online? Yeah, now you can see on the chat box, there's where you can get the tickets, or we have a more talk coming up over this weekend, inviting other directors, filmmakers, and then professional whatsoever. So do join us if you can, whether you watch the film or not. There's a lot of interesting discussion on various issues, independent films, period drama, and film reality, realism in the film. So please join us. And then I thank you for joining us today, and have a nice afternoon. Thank you. Bye.